Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a Europe where the greatest fear was not an invading army nor a deadly plague, but something far quieter. An empty field, a sky that refused to cooperate, a loaf of bread that simply never appeared. Long before supermarkets, railways, and refrigerated warehouses, survival depended almost entirely on what the land was willing to give each year. When the harvest failed, entire kingdoms trembled. Villages disappeared from maps. Families made impossible choices that no one wished to remember. Tonight, we'll wander through Europe's worst famines, not as kings or generals, but as ordinary people whose lives rose and fell with the changing seasons. You'll meet farmers, monks, bakers, merchants, mothers, and children who lived through years when hunger slowly became the most powerful force in society. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's slowly step into one of the harshest chapters in European history. The village still slept beneath a pale gray dawn when the church bell rang its first gentle note across the valley. Thin ribbons of mist drifted over damp meadows, wrapping themselves around wooden cottages whose roofs had weathered decades of wind and rain. Smoke had not yet begun to rise from most chimneys. There was little reason to hurry toward breakfast when breakfast itself had become uncertain. Our journey begins in the early 14th century, in a small farming community somewhere between the rolling fields of northern France and the rich lowlands stretching toward Flanders. The exact village no longer exists. Time erased its name long ago, as it erased thousands of others. Yet villages much like this covered medieval Europe, each one depending almost entirely upon the harvest gathered from nearby fields. The rhythm of life rarely changed. Spring invited plowing and sowing. Summer demanded endless labor beneath long days of sunlight. Autumn rewarded careful work with grain that would hopefully last until the following harvest. Winter tested everyone's patience, while precious stores gradually diminished. Every season carried responsibilities understood even by young children. Nearly everyone worked the land. Fields stretched outward in narrow strips, rather than neat, square farms. Each family cultivated several scattered pieces of earth spread across communal fields. The arrangement often appeared confusing to outsiders, but generations had accepted it as normal. No single farmer controlled one uninterrupted property. Instead, everyone shared both opportunity and risk. The crops themselves were familiar companions. Rye survived colder soils. Barley grew reliably enough to become bread and ale. Oats fed both people and livestock. Wheat remained the most desirable grain whenever conditions allowed, though it demanded better land and kinder weather. Harvests were never enormous. Even in successful years, medieval agriculture produced only modest surpluses. A family might save enough seed for next season, feed themselves, satisfy taxes owed to local lords, contribute to the church, perhaps retain a little extra should fortune smile upon them. There was almost no margin for disaster. Modern readers sometimes imagine famine as something sudden, a dramatic catastrophe arriving overnight. Medieval hunger rarely behaved that way. It approached patiently, almost politely at first. One disappointing harvest could usually be endured by tightening belts and reducing meals. Two consecutive failures became deeply worrying. A third transformed anxiety into desperation. Nature did not need to become completely hostile. It merely needed to become slightly less generous. Across Europe, population had expanded steadily during the 12th and 13th centuries. Forests had been cleared, marshes drained, hillsides cultivated despite poor soil. New villages appeared where older generations had once hunted deer beneath thick woodlands. For centuries, this expansion seemed like remarkable progress. Yet hidden beneath that success lay an uncomfortable truth. Much of Europe's new farmland produced only modest yields during favorable years. When weather deteriorated even slightly, these marginal lands suffered first. Crops growing upon thin soils possessed little resilience against excessive rain, prolonged cold, or flooding. Few people recognized how vulnerable the continent had quietly become. As another spring unfolded, the villagers noticed subtle differences that hardly seemed alarming. The mornings remained unusually cold. Clouds lingered longer than expected. The ground stayed heavy beneath their boots. Horses struggled while pulling wooden plows through waterlogged earth. Older farmers exchanged uncertain glances. Perhaps summer would correct everything. Perhaps sunshine simply arrived late this year. Hope required remarkably little evidence. Seeds disappeared beneath muddy soil, and everyone waited. The medieval calendar revolved around patience almost as much as labor. Once crops entered the earth, human effort mattered less than divine mercy. Priests led prayers asking for favorable weather. Church processions wound slowly around fields, while villagers sang hymns requesting God's blessing upon their grain. Faith and farming lived side by side. No contradiction existed between practical experience and spiritual devotion. Farmers understood soil, rainfall, and seasons intimately. Yet they also believed heaven ultimately determined whether those efforts succeeded. Weeks passed. Instead of warm sunshine, rain continued. Gentle showers occasionally benefit growing crops. This became something entirely different. Day after day, clouds emptied themselves over northern Europe. Roads dissolved into deep mud. Rivers spilled beyond their banks. Bridges disappeared beneath swollen currents. Hay refused to dry. Stored firewood absorbed moisture, until lighting household fires became frustratingly difficult. Even simple travel turned exhausting. Merchants arrived less frequently because wagons became trapped along deteriorating roads. Pack animals slipped on muddy paths. Markets received fewer goods. Small inconveniences slowly accumulated, though few yet imagined they formed part of something much larger. Inside one cottage, a woman named Agnes examined the family's grain stores, while her husband repaired tools nearby. Their youngest child asked why supper portions seemed slightly smaller than last month. Agnes smiled gently. The bread is simply sliced thinner. The explanation sounded comforting. It also happened to be true. Thinner slices could stretch flour remarkably far when necessary. Children accepted such adjustments more easily than adults because they possessed little memory of previous harvests. Their world consisted almost entirely of today. Parents carried a heavier burden. They remembered abundant years. They recognized warning signs. Nearby, the village mill remained unusually quiet. Ordinarily, its water wheel turned steadily as grain poured inward from surrounding farms. Now fewer sacks arrived. The miller noticed immediately. Millers occupied an unusual position within medieval society. Nearly every household eventually passed through their doors. They observed harvest quality, grain quantities, and subtle changes invisible to outsiders. If flour became darker, they knew. If kernels shrank, they noticed. If farmers hesitated before surrendering precious grain for grinding, they understood why. That autumn, conversations grew increasingly cautious. Nobody wished to speak the frightening possibility aloud. Still, everyone sensed it. The harvest looked disappointing. Fields that normally shimmered with heavy heads of grain now appeared patchy and uneven. Some stalks bent beneath healthy kernels. Others stood nearly empty. Entire sections remained flattened, where relentless rain had encouraged rot before crops could fully mature. Harvest time, nevertheless, demanded urgency. Workers rushed into fields whenever brief sunshine appeared. Entire families participated. Elderly grandparents gathered scattered ears of grain left behind after reaping. Young children tied bundles together. Every handful mattered. No one wasted anything. Even mice attracted unusual attention because they competed for the same precious stores humans desperately required. Barns gradually filled, yet they did not fill enough. Village elders quietly estimated available grain against expected winter consumption. Their calculations offered little comfort. Perhaps neighboring regions enjoyed better harvests. Perhaps merchants could import additional supplies. Perhaps prices would rise only slightly. Again, hope survived upon fragile foundations. In larger towns, bakers encountered their own difficulties. Flour arriving from rural districts became more expensive almost every market day. Bakers disliked increasing bread prices because customers complained loudly. Yet selling inexpensive bread made little sense if replacing flour cost even more. Some responded by baking smaller loaves. Others mixed barley, oats, peas, or beans into flour, traditionally reserved for wheat. Bread changed almost imperceptibly at first. Its texture became denser. Its color darkened. Its flavor grew earthier. Most customers noticed. Few had alternatives. Across monasteries, monks carefully recorded unusual weather inside handwritten chronicles. They described endless rainfall, damaged harvests, flooded meadows, and mounting concern among nearby villages. These quiet observations, copied carefully onto parchment by candlelight, would eventually become invaluable evidence for historians centuries later. The monks themselves were not immune. Monasteries often possessed larger estates and better storage facilities than ordinary villages, allowing them to weather difficult years more comfortably. Nevertheless, declining harvests reduced charitable distributions. Fewer travelers received generous meals. Even religious communities tightened consumption when uncertainty lingered. Winter finally arrived. Snow itself caused little concern. Snow often protected winter crops beneath an insulating blanket. What frightened people was what remained inside storage bins. Families counted sacks repeatedly. Some estimated how long each loaf needed to last. Others quietly sold possessions in exchange for additional grain before prices climbed even higher. Iron cooking pots, extra blankets, a healthy goat, an old silver brooch inherited from grandparents. Objects accumulated over lifetimes, suddenly transformed into food. Money mattered only because it could still purchase bread. By late winter, that assumption itself began to weaken. Merchants entering regional markets discovered growing crowds competing for limited supplies. Grain dealers quickly realized demand far exceeded availability. Prices rose again, then rose again, not because merchants were always greedy, although some certainly were, but because grain itself had genuinely become scarce. Economics felt very different when viewed through an empty stomach. The poorest laborers suffered first. Unlike farmers, they possessed no private grain stores. Unlike wealthy nobles, they lacked savings substantial enough to absorb rising prices. Their survival depended upon wages earned almost daily. When food doubled in cost, while wages remained unchanged, arithmetic became painfully simple. Meals disappeared. At first, families skipped breakfast, later supper. Eventually, they ate once each day. Then not even that. Yet despite everything, spring approached once more. The villagers watched melting snow-soaked fields, already saturated by months of relentless moisture. They sharpened plows, prepared seed, looked toward the horizon. Everything now depended upon the coming growing season. If nature showed mercy, recovery remained possible. If the rains returned, Europe would soon discover that one disappointing harvest had only been the beginning. The first warm days of spring usually carried a sense of relief. Birds returned to hedgerows, lambs stumbled across green pastures, and children once again found excuses to linger outdoors. After the long darkness of winter, even the smallest signs of life reminded people that another harvest was possible. This year, however, optimism arrived with hesitation. The soil remained strangely heavy beneath every footstep. Pools of standing water still covered low-lying fields where grain should soon be growing. Farmers pressed damp earth between rough fingers, silently judging whether it could support another season. Most already knew the answer before speaking. It was too wet. Still, there was no choice but to plant. Seeds represented both hope and terrible risk. Every handful scattered across the fields was grain that could no longer be eaten. Families willingly sacrificed part of their remaining food because failing to sow meant certain starvation later. They buried precious kernels beneath saturated soil and prayed they had not just buried their future. Throughout much of northern Europe, the weather refused to cooperate. Cold winds lingered well beyond their usual season. Thick clouds gathered almost daily, carrying wave after wave of rain across England, Scotland, northern France, the Low Countries, western Germany, and parts of Scandinavia. Rivers remained swollen for months. Streams overflowed into meadows where livestock normally grazed. For medieval people, weather was never simply a topic of conversation. It decided nearly everything. Modern agriculture benefits from drainage systems, engineered seeds, fertilizers, weather forecasting, and machinery capable of rescuing crops during narrow windows of opportunity. None of those advantages existed in the early 14th century. Farmers depended upon simple wooden tools, teams of oxen, and generations of practical knowledge, passed from parent to child. Against endless rain, experience alone offered little protection. As the weeks passed, seedlings emerged unevenly. Entire patches failed completely. Elsewhere, young plants developed weak roots that struggled inside waterlogged ground. Wheat yellowed instead of deepening into healthy green. Rye survived somewhat better, but even the hardiest crops looked exhausted. The village priest continued leading processions through muddy lanes. Children carried simple wooden crosses. Women sang familiar hymns. Men walked with bowed heads, their boots sinking into soft earth with every step. Together they asked heaven for sunlight, not endless prosperity, not wealth, only enough warmth to save the harvest. Their prayers echoed across soaked fields before disappearing into another curtain of rain. Far beyond this single village, similar scenes unfolded across an enormous stretch of Europe. From the fertile plains of France to the hills of Wales, from Irish valleys to German forests, countless communities faced remarkably similar conditions without realizing millions of others shared the same struggle. News traveled slowly. A merchant arriving from another county might mention flooded roads or poor crops elsewhere, but no one possessed a complete picture. There were no newspapers, no weather maps, no governments collecting continent-wide agricultural reports. Each village believed its suffering might be local. Only much later would chroniclers understand how unusually widespread the disaster had become. One afternoon, a traveling merchant finally reached the village after spending nearly twice the usual time upon the road. His wagon looked exhausted. Its wheels carried thick layers of dried mud. One horse limped noticeably. Villagers gathered around, not because his goods were especially luxurious, but because travelers carried information almost as valuable as food. He described collapsed bridges farther west, flooded market towns, grain shortages in districts that normally exported large quantities. One elderly farmer listened quietly before asking the question everyone feared. Did you see healthy fields anywhere? The merchant paused. He searched his memory. Finally, he shook his head. Not many. The answer settled over the crowd more heavily than anyone wished to admit. Inside manor houses, local lords confronted uncomfortable realities of their own. Popular imagination often portrays medieval nobles as untouched by hardship. Yet even wealthy landowners depended upon productive estates. Their income came largely through rents, harvests, livestock, and obligations owed by tenant farmers. If peasants harvested less grain, landlords collected less as well. Some nobles responded with patience, reducing demands where circumstances clearly justified mercy. Others insisted upon receiving traditional dues, regardless of conditions. Those decisions would shape countless relationships during the difficult years ahead. Meanwhile, monasteries expanded their charitable efforts despite shrinking resources. Each morning, lines formed outside monastery gates. Widows, orphans, disabled laborers, old men unable to work, travelers stranded far from home. Every loaf distributed represented compassion. Yet, every loaf also reduced supplies needed by the monks themselves. The brothers understood the arithmetic perfectly. Still, turning away hungry neighbors contradicted everything they believed their vocation required. Some monasteries exhausted their reserves astonishingly quickly as spring slowly gave way to early summer. Livestock introduced another growing concern. Hay harvested the previous year had been poor. Fresh grass developed slowly beneath persistent rain. Many animals emerged from winter thinner than usual. Cows produced less milk. Sheep weakened. Oxen, the very animals needed for plowing, lost strength precisely when heavy work demanded their greatest effort. Farmers faced heartbreaking decisions. Keeping livestock alive required feeding them grain, increasingly needed by people. Selling animals flooded local markets with desperate sellers. driving prices downward. Slaughtering breeding animals solved today's hunger while reducing future prosperity. Every choice carried consequences, extending months or even years beyond the immediate crisis. One evening, Agnes and her husband sat quietly beside their small fire after the children had fallen asleep. The room remained unusually silent. No bread baked that afternoon. Instead, supper had consisted of a thin stew containing onions, cabbage, a handful of beans, and only enough grain to thicken the broth slightly. Her husband stared into the flames. "We may have to sell one of the oxen." Agnes looked up immediately. "If we do that, I know, without 2 oxen, plowing next season would become dramatically slower and more difficult. Yet keeping both animals alive required feed they scarcely possessed." Such conversations occurred inside thousands upon thousands of cottages. They were never dramatic. No raised voices, no theatrical arguments, simply ordinary people attempting to solve impossible equations. Elsewhere, village children quietly adapted in ways adults seldom noticed. Games changed. Instead of pretending to be knights or hunters, some spent afternoons searching hedgerows for edible plants. They learned which leaves could be boiled, which roots tasted bitter but filled empty stomachs, which berries should never be touched. Knowledge once considered useful gradually became essential. Women possessed particularly valuable experience in this regard. Generations had passed down practical understanding of wild herbs, mushrooms, nuts, and seasonal greens. Although these foods rarely replaced grain, they helped stretch shrinking supplies. Nettles became soup, sorrel-flavored stews, acorns, after careful preparation to remove bitterness, occasionally supplemented flour. Nothing edible remained beneath notice. Even so, Europe's growing population placed enormous pressure upon the landscape. Woodlands that once supplied game had been reduced significantly over previous centuries. Deer largely belonged to noble hunting preserves. Fishing rights often remained controlled by landlords or monasteries. Wild food existed, but nowhere near enough to sustain entire communities. Nature offered assistance. She could not feed millions. By midsummer, the first unmistakable signs of real hunger appeared. Faces became thinner. Children tired more quickly. Laborers paused more frequently during work. The strongest adults concealed their own hunger by quietly reducing personal portions, so younger family members could eat slightly more. Parents became experts at pretending they were not hungry. "I ate earlier. I'm not very hungry today." "You finish it." Simple sentences, repeated countless times. At village ovens, the appearance of bread continued changing. Fine white loaves had become rare luxuries. Dark rye bread dominated most tables, even that now contained increasing quantities of peas, beans, ground oats, and whatever fillers bakers could safely incorporate. Some experiments succeeded. Others produced heavy loaves that crumbled apart almost immediately. Nobody complained. Imperfection still tasted better than emptiness. The local blacksmith noticed fewer customers. Broken tools remained unrepaired longer. Horseshoes lasted beyond their proper life. People postponed every expense unrelated to food. The village tailor experienced the same decline. So did potters, carpenters, basket makers. When grain became expensive, nearly every other trade suffered alongside it. The famine had not yet reached its worst stage, but already the entire rural economy was beginning to slow. Historians sometimes describe famine merely through numbers. Harvest percentages, price increases, mortality estimates. Yet statistics cannot fully explain what daily life felt like. Imagine waking each morning calculating food before thinking about anything else. Imagine every conversation eventually drifting toward bread. Imagine measuring time not by festivals or holidays, but by how many weeks remained until harvest. That quiet mental burden accompanied people everywhere. Even joyful occasions changed. Weddings became smaller because hosting large feasts consumed too much food. Village celebrations lost much of their music. Pilgrimages declined. Hospitality grew cautious. Travelers, who once expected generous meals, now often received apologies instead. Not from cruelty, from necessity. Late that summer, another merchant reached the village carrying disturbing rumors from England. He spoke of ports receiving fewer grain shipments, prices climbing in London, flooded fields across eastern counties. At first, listeners assumed he exaggerated to make conversation more interesting. Travelers often embroidered stories. Weeks later, another merchant reported nearly identical accounts. Then a monk traveling south confirmed similar conditions. Bit by bit, villagers realized something unsettling. This was not one unfortunate district. It was not even one kingdom. The weather had damaged harvests across much of northern Europe simultaneously. There would be no nearby region overflowing, with surplus grain ready to rescue everyone else. The safety net medieval society usually relied upon had begun to disappear. As harvest season approached once again, every eye turned toward the fields. Families walked among the grain in silence. Some bent low, counting kernels. Others rubbed heads of wheat between weathered palms. Hopping, they appeared fuller than expected. Children sensed the unusual seriousness surrounding them. Even they stopped asking hopeful questions. No one wished to guess too early. Harvest finally began under skies that remained stubbornly gray. Workers swung sickles from dawn until fatting evening light. Bundles accumulated across the fields. Yet as wagons returned toward barns, experienced farmers immediately noticed the difference. They required more wagon loads to gather less grain. Heads of wheat looked disappointingly light. Rye fared only slightly better. Barley yields had suffered badly. Oats varied from field to field, but nowhere approached abundance. When thrashing finished weeks later, reality became impossible to ignore. The second harvest had failed almost as badly as the first. In some places, it proved even worse. Across Europe, church bells rang as they always had. Autumn markets opened as they always had. The seasons themselves appeared unchanged. But inside barns, monasteries, castles, cottages, and city storehouses, people stared at dwindling supplies and slowly understood a terrifying truth. Winter was coming again. This time, there would be far less food waiting for it. Autumn settled quietly over the countryside, painting hedgerows with fading greens and muted golds. From a distance, the landscape still possessed a peaceful beauty that poets would have admired. Morning fog drifted lazily through valleys. Flocks of birds crossed pale skies on their annual migrations. Apple trees surrendered their fruit one by one beneath cool breezes. Nature itself did not appear to be in crisis. That was one of famine's cruelest qualities. The world could remain beautiful, while the people living within it slowly unraveled. Inside nearly every cottage, the ritual of storing food for winter had become painfully brief. Previous generations remembered barns packed tightly, with sacks of grain stacked nearly to the rafters. This year, there were empty spaces everywhere. Agnes stood inside the family's small storage shed, with a candle held close to the shelves. She counted the sacks once, then again. Nothing changed. Her husband entered quietly, without asking what she had discovered. He already knew. Neither spoke for several moments. Sometimes silence carried more honesty than words ever could. Finally, he picked up a small wooden board that he normally used for marking the family's grain consumption throughout the winter. Each notch represented another measure removed from storage. This year, he stared at the board before placing it back on the shelf. "There is no reason to measure it," he said softly. "We already know." For centuries, medieval households had relied upon experience rather than precise mathematics. Parents knew roughly how much grain each person required between harvests. They understood how long cheese might last, how much salted pork remained edible through winter, and how many chickens could be spared before spring. Experience now delivered only unwelcome conclusions. The food would not last. The realization spread gradually through villages across Europe. No dramatic announcement declared the beginning of famine. There was no single day when people awoke and recognized history unfolding around them. Instead, ordinary routines changed almost unnoticed. Breakfast became smaller. Ale contained less grain. Soup grew thinner. Bread shrank. Then one meal quietly disappeared from the day altogether. People adapted because adaptation had always been part of rural life. Every difficult season required adjustments. What frightened older villagers was not the hardship itself. It was how early these sacrifices had begun. Usually, serious rationing started toward the end of winter, when supplies naturally dwindled. Now families reduced portions before autumn had fully ended. That had happened only rarely within living memory. Across England, chroniclers later recorded that grain prices continued climbing month after month. In some markets, wheat became so expensive that laborers could no longer afford even the coarsest bread. Rye followed the same pattern. Barley, once considered relatively inexpensive, also became difficult to obtain. Prices alone rarely tell the full story. Imagine earning exactly the same wages, while the cost of every meal doubled, then doubled again. The coins inside a worker's pocket had not changed. Only their ability to buy survival had quietly disappeared. Market days became strangely subdued. Ordinarily, they were lively occasions filled with conversation, music, bargaining, wandering entertainers, and children chasing one another between stalls. Now people moved with greater purpose. Nearly everyone walked directly toward grain merchants first. If grain remained affordable, they might purchase cloth or tools afterward. Increasingly, there was no afterward. Money vanished into food before anything else could even be considered. Merchants noticed another subtle transformation. Customers no longer asked which grain tasted best. They simply asked what remained. Quality surrendered to necessity. Some buyers accepted damaged grain that would previously have been rejected. Others purchased flour mixed with husks and fragments usually removed during milling. Anything capable of becoming bread held value. Millers worked longer hours despite receiving fewer deliveries. Farmers brought every kernel they could spare. Broken grains, weather-damaged harvests, small quantities collected from scattered fields. The millstones turned steadily, producing darker flour than anyone preferred. Nobody complained. Complaints belonged to easier times. Far away, in great cities like Paris, London, and Bruges, urban populations felt the crisis differently. City dwellers rarely produced their own food. Instead, they depended entirely upon supplies arriving from surrounding countryside. When rural harvests failed, urban markets became dangerously vulnerable. Officials attempted to stabilize prices. Some cities prohibited grain exports. Others inspected merchants, accused of hoarding supplies. Authorities feared more than hunger itself. They feared disorder. Bread riots had occurred before. Governments understood that hungry crowds could become unpredictable with remarkable speed. Most people, however, remained astonishingly patient, contrary to popular imagination. Famine seldom transformed ordinary communities into immediate chaos. Neighbors continued helping one another whenever possible. Families shared modest meals. Villages organized assistance for widows and the elderly. Churches distributed what little they possessed. Kindness often persisted long after resources began disappearing. Yet kindness itself had limits. One loaf, divided between two families, became half a loaf each. Divided among 10 families, it scarcely remained a meal. As November advanced, livestock entered another dangerous season. Hay supplies had never fully recovered from previous failures. Farmers inspected their animals with growing concern. A healthy ox represented years of careful investment. Strong horses remained invaluable. Breeding cows promised future calves and milk, yet keeping them alive required feed that humans increasingly needed themselves. The difficult conversations returned. Perhaps they should slaughter another cow, perhaps 2 pigs, perhaps most of the chickens. Salted meat could preserve valuable calories through winter, keeping every animal alive until spring might prove impossible. Across Europe, thousands reached similar conclusions. The sounds of livestock being slaughtered arrived earlier than usual. Smokehouses became active, while temperatures remained relatively mild. At first glance, this seemed sensible. More preserved meat should improve winter survival. Yet beneath the decision hid another tragedy. Animals killed this autumn would not produce milk next spring. They would not pull plows. They would not bear offspring. Each slaughter quietly weakened the following year's agricultural recovery. People were borrowing food from the future because the present demanded payment immediately. Children sensed changes adults rarely discussed openly. Conversations stopped whenever they entered the room. Parents smiled more deliberately. Stories before bedtime grew longer, perhaps because stories distracted hungry minds. One evening, Agnes tucked her youngest son beneath a rough wool blanket. He looked up sleepily. "Will there be enough bread when the snow comes?" She hesitated only briefly. "There always has been." It was not exactly an answer. Neither was it exactly untrue. Until now, the boy accepted her reassurance and soon drifted asleep. Agnes remained seated beside the bed long after his breathing became steady. Outside, rain tapped gently against the wooden shutters once again. Another storm, another night, another reminder that the weather still refused to change. Elsewhere in the village, the blacksmith's forge burned less frequently. Few customers possessed spare money for new tools. Broken plowshares waited weeks before repair. Kitchen knives remained dull. Iron nails became small luxuries. Economic hardship spread outward from hunger, like ripples across water. Even people who still possessed food discovered fewer opportunities to earn income. A wheelwright repaired fewer wagons. A cooper built fewer barrels. Shoemakers patched old footwear instead of crafting new boots. Nearly every profession slowed. Famine was never simply about empty stomachs. It quietly untangled the entire fabric of medieval society. Monasteries faced impossible choices. For generations, religious houses had welcomed pilgrims, travelers, and the poor with dependable hospitality. Their reputation rested partly upon generosity. Now the lines outside monastery gates grew longer every week. Some visitors had walked astonishing distances. Hopping larger abbeys still possessed grain. The monks distributed bread as long as they could. Eventually, portions became smaller, then smaller still. One elderly monk carefully recorded the day's distributions inside a manuscript. Beside the usual notes about weather and religious observances, he added a simple sentence. There were more hungry than bread. The words occupied little space upon the parchment. Their meaning filled entire generations. Throughout much of Europe, forests attracted increasing numbers of desperate visitors. Women searched for nuts overlooked during autumn gathering. Men set crude traps, hopping to catch rabbits. Children collected fallen acorns by the basket. Normally, such efforts merely supplemented household diets. Now they became essential. Woodlands slowly grew quieter, not because fewer people entered them, because the available food disappeared quickly. Wild animals became harder to find. Edible plants vanished soon after appearing. Nature's pantry, never limitless, emptied alongside human storehouses. Winter announced itself with the season's first heavy frost. Thin sheets of ice formed across puddles. Morning grass glittered beneath pale sunlight. The beauty lasted only moments before boots shattered the frozen surface. For many villagers, cold weather carried mixed emotions. Freezing temperatures finally halted endless rain. Roads gradually became firmer. Travel improved slightly. Yet winter also meant crops would no longer grow. Whatever remained inside barns would have to sustain life until spring. One Sunday after Mass, villagers lingered outside the church despite the cold. Small groups formed naturally. Nobody laughed very loudly. Conversations returned repeatedly to the same subject. Bread, grain, prices, rumors. One traveler claimed ships carrying Baltic grain might arrive before Christmas. Another insisted southern regions had enjoyed better harvests. Someone else believed the king would intervene. Hope attached itself eagerly to every rumor, regardless of how uncertain. Information traveled slowly enough that optimism could survive for weeks before reality caught up. The village reeve attempted to reassure everyone. He encouraged careful rationing. He reminded families to protect seed grain reserved for spring planting. Under no circumstances, he warned, should anyone consume it. Several listeners lowered their eyes. Some had already begun considering exactly that. Eating seed grain guaranteed one more meal today. Preserving it offered only the possibility of food many months later. Starvation had a remarkable ability to shorten people's horizons. Every sunrise demanded immediate answers. The distant future became difficult to imagine. As December approached, snow finally covered the fields. White blankets concealed muddy scars left by months of relentless rain. From a distance, the countryside almost resembled healthier years. Children even found brief moments of joy, throwing handfuls of snow at one another near the village green. Adults smiled while watching them. The smiles faded quickly. Snow also concealed empty fields where next year's hope should already have been growing. In castles, monasteries, villages, and crowded towns, candles flickered against long winter nights. People gathered around fires that seemed smaller than they remembered. Meals ended sooner. Loaves disappeared faster. Storage bins looked emptier every time their lids were lifted. No one yet knew that historians would one day call this catastrophe the Great Famine of 1315, 1317, asterisk asterisk. To those living through it, it had no famous name. It was simply their life. And as Christmas drew near, Europe was about to discover that the hardest months were not behind them. They were waiting silently in the frozen darkness ahead. Christmas arrived with church bells echoing across frozen fields, just as it had for generations before. Candles illuminated stained glass windows. Choirs sang familiar hymns. The scent of evergreen branches filled chapels and parish churches from Ireland to the Baltic coast. Yet the celebrations felt quieter than anyone could remember. The great feast days of the medieval calendar normally offered rare opportunities to forget hardship, if only briefly. Families gathered around tables carrying fresh bread, roasted meat, thick stews, wheels of cheese, and ale brewed during the autumn months. Children anticipated sweet treats reserved for special occasions, while neighbors exchanged gifts that were often simple but meaningful. This year, many tables looked painfully different. A loaf of coarse rye bread occupied the center where several dishes had once stood. Thin cabbage soup replaced hearty stews. Salted fish, when available, was divided into portions so modest they scarcely seemed worth cutting. Some families celebrated without meat altogether. Nobody wished to admit how unusual it felt. Instead, they thanked God for what little remained. The priest reminded his congregation that difficult seasons had always tested human faith. He spoke gently about patience, charity, and perseverance. He quoted passages promising that suffering did not last forever. His words brought comfort. They did not bring food. When the service ended, people lingered outside despite the bitter cold. There was comfort simply in seeing familiar faces. Neighbors quietly exchanged tiny gifts: a pair of knitted mittens, a carved wooden spoon, a small piece of beeswax for making candles. Objects that required little food to produce had suddenly become the most thoughtful presents imaginable. Agnes returned home carrying a small round of cheese that an elderly widow had insisted she accept. The widow herself possessed almost nothing. "You have children," she had whispered. "They need it more." Agnes knew the widow probably needed it just as much. Acts of generosity often flowed toward those who appeared slightly worse off, even when everyone struggled together. Historians frequently note that communities survived famine not only through stored grain, but through cooperation. Families borrowed from relatives, monasteries fed strangers, villages organized collective harvesting, and neighbors quietly shared what they could spare. These invisible networks of kindness delayed catastrophe for many, but they could not defeat it indefinitely. January arrived beneath skies, as gray as worn wool. The cold deepened, streams froze, the earth hardened beneath layers of frost. Travel became easier now that roads no longer dissolved into mud. But movement alone solved little. Merchants continued searching for grain wherever supplies remained, only to discover similar shortages almost everywhere they traveled. The great markets of northern Europe had begun competing against one another. Every town wanted grain. Every village wanted grain. Every monastery wanted grain. Every castle wanted grain. There simply was not enough. In ordinary years, regions blessed with abundant harvests exported surplus to places experiencing local failures. That system had functioned reasonably well for centuries. The crisis of 1315 was different. Large portions of Europe had suffered simultaneously. There were fewer prosperous neighbors capable of helping. Even successful districts hesitated before selling precious reserves, uncertain whether they themselves might soon need every sack. Some rulers attempted to intervene. Royal officials inspected grain stores. Certain towns introduced price controls. Others temporarily banned exports beyond regional borders. A few authorities punished merchants accused of hiding supplies in hopes of earning higher prices later. Whether those accusations were always fair remained uncertain. Some merchants undoubtedly sought greater profits. Others simply possessed too little grain to satisfy desperate demand. When everyone wanted the same limited resource, suspicion flourished almost as quickly as hunger. Rumors spread through villages faster than facts. Someone claimed a wealthy abbey nearby possessed enormous hidden granaries. Another insisted noble households continued hosting extravagant feasts while peasants starved. Stories circulated of wagons filled with grain secretly traveling at night beneath armed guards. Occasionally, such tales contained fragments of truth. More often, they reflected frustration, searching for somewhere to settle. Hunger encouraged people to believe that someone, somewhere, must be responsible. Reality proved far less satisfying. The weather itself had become their greatest enemy. Inside the village mill, the miller found himself facing uncomfortable accusations. Customers complained that flour seemed lighter than expected. Some suspected he removed extra grain before returning their meal. Millers had long occupied an uneasy place within medieval society. Their profession depended upon trust, yet few customers could easily verify whether they received every handful they deserved. The miller patiently explained the obvious. The grain arriving at his mill contained smaller kernels. Damaged harvests naturally produced less flour. He had not stolen anything. Still, doubt lingered. Scarcity eroded confidence, even among longtime neighbors. As winter dragged onward, people began consuming foods they ordinarily reserved for emergencies. Peas once intended as seed disappeared into cooking pots. Beans carefully stored for spring planting became supper instead. Chestnuts collected months earlier vanished quickly. Households stretched flour with whatever ingredients remained available. Ground acorns, crushed legumes, even finely chopped bark from certain trees occasionally appeared in desperate recipes. Though it provided little nourishment and often caused stomach problems, these substitutes filled the mouth more effectively than they sustained the body. Children noticed another change. Their parents stopped speaking about spring with certainty. During ordinary winters, conversations naturally turned toward next season. Which field should receive oats? Where would new fencing be needed? Would another cow calve before Easter? Now those discussions became strangely hesitant. Planning required confidence that one would still be alive to see those plans unfold. No one said such thoughts aloud. They simply spoke less about the future. Agnes watched her husband become quieter with every passing week. He still completed daily chores. He still repaired tools. He still cared for the remaining livestock. But evenings ended differently now. Instead of telling stories beside the fire, he often sat listening to the wind pressing against the cottage walls. One night he finally spoke. I remember my father describing a difficult winter. Agnes nodded. So do I. He said people thought it could never become worse. She waited. It did. Neither added anything more. The fire crackled softly between them. Elsewhere across Europe, monasteries continued documenting remarkable details with disciplined precision. One chronicler described persistent shortages so severe that many poor people wandered from village to village searching for food. Another recorded that grain prices had risen beyond anything older residents could remember. Elsewhere, monks wrote about horses dying from inadequate fodder, cattle becoming too weak to work, and fields left uncultivated because surviving animals lacked the strength to pull plows. Reading these manuscripts centuries later, historians noticed something striking. The writers rarely filled their pages with dramatic emotion. Instead, they simply observed. Rained, cold, poor harvest, high prices, empty granaries. Their restraint somehow made the situation feel even more haunting. Facts required little embellishment. By February, visible signs of malnutrition appeared with increasing frequency. Laborers lost muscle, faces became hollow, minor illnesses lingered longer than before, cuts healed slowly, children tired after only short periods of play. Modern medicine explains these changes easily enough. Without sufficient calories and nutrients, the human body begins conserving energy wherever possible. The immune system weakens, growth slows, recovery becomes increasingly difficult. Medieval people lacked scientific explanations. They simply noticed neighbors becoming thinner every week. Livestock fared little better. Farmers reluctantly slaughtered additional animals because winter feed had nearly disappeared. Oxen, indispensable for spring plowing, represented especially painful losses. Each animal that died reduced the community's ability to recover once favorable. Weather eventually returned. The famine was beginning to feed upon itself. Poor harvests reduced fodder. Weak livestock reduced future harvests. Smaller harvests produced even less fodder. The cycle tightened quietly, season after season. One afternoon, the village carpenter stopped by Agnes's cottage. He carried no tools, only questions. Had they heard whether merchants from the south planned to arrive before Easter? Had anyone spoken of grain ships reaching nearby ports? Did they know if neighboring villages possessed surplus seed? Every answer remained uncertain. The carpenter sighed. My father always said winter eventually ends. Agnes managed a faint smile. It will. He looked toward the snow-covered fields. I hope spring remembers us. His words sounded strangely poetic, without intending to be. Throughout history, famine has often been remembered through extraordinary acts of desperation. Those events certainly occurred, but before societies reached such terrible moments came countless quieter ones like this. Conversations, shared worries, hope sustained by rumors. Ordinary people trying very hard to remain ordinary. The psychological burden became almost as exhausting as physical hunger. Every morning began with calculation. How much flour remained? How much firewood? How many eggs had the hens laid? Could one more chicken be spared? Would another week pass before anyone dared open the final grain sack? Life gradually narrowed until survival occupied nearly every waking thought. Yet despite everything, signs of approaching spring slowly emerged. The sun lingered slightly longer each evening. Icicles began dripping beneath midday warmth. Snow retreated from south-facing hillsides. Streams awakened beneath cracking sheets of ice. These familiar changes usually inspired excitement. This year, they inspired anxiety, because everyone understood what came next. Fields would need plowing, seed would need planting, and the community possessed fewer animals, fewer reserves, and far fewer healthy people than it had 1 year earlier. If spring arrived with sunshine, there remained hope. If the rains returned, the continent's fragile strength might finally begin to break. By early March, winter's grip began to loosen across much of Europe. Snow retreated into shaded corners of forests and along the northern sides of hills. Streams flowed freely again, carrying fragments of ice downstream toward larger rivers. Birds returned cautiously, their songs echoing through landscapes that had spent months beneath silence and frost. Under ordinary circumstances, these signs would have lifted spirits. This year they brought unease. People were no longer worried only about surviving the present. They feared the future with equal intensity. Every conversation eventually arrived at the same question: what kind of spring awaited them? The answer would determine whether the famine gradually eased or deepened into something even worse. Throughout villages, towns, monasteries, and manor estates, preparations for planting began despite widespread exhaustion. Medieval agriculture allowed little room for delay. Fields had to be plowed, seeds scattered, drainage ditches repaired, fences rebuilt, and livestock moved to fresh grazing land. The problem was painfully obvious. Many communities no longer possessed the strength they once had. Months of inadequate nutrition had weakened laborers. Families that normally supplied 4 or 5 healthy workers could now contribute only 2 or 3 capable of performing heavy tasks for long periods. Even those who remained physically able often found themselves tiring more quickly. Tasks that once required a day now consumed 2. Work that had once seemed routine became a struggle. Agnes noticed it immediately. Her husband had always been strong. Years spent behind a plow had hardened his shoulders and thickened his hands. Yet one afternoon, after only a few hours repairing drainage channels near the fields, he returned home, breathing heavily. He sat quietly on a wooden stool. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, he shook his head. I should not be tired, but he was, and so was nearly everyone else. The famine had not merely reduced food supplies, it had slowly drained energy from an entire society. Meanwhile, another problem emerged: seed grain. Throughout the winter, village leaders and experienced farmers had repeatedly urged families to preserve grain intended for spring planting. Many had tried. Some had succeeded. Others had not. Hunger possessed a remarkable ability to override long-term planning. When children cried from empty stomachs, a sack of seed grain no longer represented next year's harvest. It represented tonight's meal. Across Europe, countless households had consumed at least part of their seed reserves. Now they faced an impossible dilemma. Without seed, fields would remain empty. Without planting, there could be no future harvest. Yet acquiring replacement grain had become extraordinarily difficult. Prices remained painfully high. Some families borrowed from wealthier neighbors. Others appealed to monasteries. A few landlords distributed seed in hopes of preserving the productivity of their estates. Not everyone received help. In some regions, farmers planted whatever they could find: lower quality grain, damaged kernels, seed that would normally have been rejected. Anything capable of growing became valuable. The gamble reflected desperation more than confidence. As March progressed, people watched the skis almost constantly. For several weeks, conditions seemed encouraging. Cool temperatures persisted, but the rains remained limited. The ground gradually dried. Oxen moved through fields once again. Wooden plows cut dark furrows through earth that had been inaccessible for months. Hope cautiously returned. One could almost feel Europe collectively holding its breath. Perhaps the worst had passed. Perhaps last year's disaster would remain an exception. Perhaps God had finally decided enough suffering had occurred. In villages across England, France, and the Low Countries, farmers worked from dawn until dusk, attempting to make up for lost time. The sight brought comfort. There was something reassuring about seeing familiar seasonal rhythms return. Plows, seed baskets, teams of laborers, the ordinary machinery of medieval life slowly reawakening. For a brief period, optimism felt reasonable. Then the rain returned. At first, nobody panicked. A few wet days in spring were hardly unusual. Rain nourished crops. It replenished streams. It encouraged growth. The problem was not the arrival of rain. The problem was that it refused to leave. Week after week, storms crossed northern Europe. Dark clouds gathered over fields that had only recently begun drying. Freshly plowed furrows filled with water. Newly planted seed sat in saturated soil once again. Farmers looked toward the heavens with growing disbelief. Many could scarcely comprehend what they were witnessing. The previous years, misery had seemed extraordinary. Now nature appeared determined to repeat it. In some places, conditions became even worse. Roads deteriorated rapidly. Carts sank into mud. Bridges suffered flood damage. Transport slowed almost immediately. Merchants who had hoped to move grain between regions encountered the same obstacles that had plagued them before. Once again, Europe found itself trapped. Even when food existed somewhere, moving it efficiently became difficult. The infrastructure of the medieval world had always been fragile. The famine exposed that fragility relentlessly. At the village mill, the miller watched river levels rise with concern. The water wheel itself functioned perfectly well. Too much water, however, could be almost as troublesome as too little. Flooding damaged approaches to the mill. Wagons struggled to reach it. Nearby paths disappeared beneath standing water. The landscape seemed determined to resist every effort at recovery. Elsewhere, livestock faced renewed challenges. Pastures remained wet and muddy. Diseases spread more easily among weakened animals crowded into poor conditions. Cattle suffered. Sheep struggled. Horses lost condition. Every loss carried consequences, extending far beyond the animal itself. A dead ox was not merely a dead animal. It was lost labor, lost transportation, lost agricultural productivity, lost hope. Throughout Europe, chroniclers continued recording what they observed. One monk described endless rainfall, so persistent that it seemed impossible to dry clothing properly. Another noted that grain prices remained alarmingly high despite the arrival of spring. Several writers mentioned widespread anxiety among both peasants and nobles. The mood had changed. A year earlier, many people had viewed poor harvests as temporary misfortune. Now they began fearing something larger, something enduring. The crisis no longer felt like an interruption. It felt like a new reality. In towns, bread remained the central concern. Bakers continued modifying recipes to stretch scarce flour. Customers accepted loaves they would once have rejected. Dark bread, dense bread, bread mixed with peas, beans, oats, and whatever ingredients remained available. The distinction between preferred food and available food had largely disappeared. People ate what existed, nothing more. One afternoon, Agnes joined several other women gathering edible plants along the edges of a nearby woodland. The activity had become increasingly common. Every household searched for supplemental food wherever it could be found. The women moved slowly, identifying familiar species passed down through generations of practical knowledge. Young nettles, wild garlic, sorrel, various greens capable of adding substance to soups. Their baskets gradually filled, not abundantly, not enough to solve anything, but enough to help. As they worked, conversation drifted naturally toward the weather. No one needed to mention the obvious. Everyone noticed the clouds. Everyone heard the rain during the night. Everyone understood what another failed harvest might mean. One older woman finally voiced the fear many carried. What happens if this crop fails too? Silence followed, not because nobody understood the question, because nobody possessed an answer. Back in the village, the blacksmith faced his own difficulties. Demand for repairs remained high, yet fewer customers could afford payment. Many offered grain instead of coin. Others proposed future compensation after the next harvest. The blacksmith accepted whenever possible. Refusing would help nobody. Yet he too needed food. His family experienced the same shortages, affecting everyone else. The famine blurred traditional economic boundaries. Even skilled craftsmen found themselves vulnerable. As April approached, church services grew increasingly focused on prayer for favorable weather. Processions crossed fields once again. Villagers carried religious banners through muddy lanes. Some communities organized special fasts. Others sponsored additional masses. Faith offered structure during uncertainty. When people lacked control over events, prayer remained one action they could still choose. Whether one views those prayers through a religious or historical lens, they reveal something important. Medieval people were not passive victims waiting helplessly for disaster. They actively searched for solutions, using every tool available to them: agricultural knowledge, community cooperation, trade, government intervention, religious practice. Nothing was ignored. The tragedy lay in the fact that many of those efforts could not overcome relentless environmental conditions. By late April, the fields themselves began revealing troubling signs. Some crops emerged unevenly. Others displayed weak growth. Waterlogged sections produced sparse stands where healthy grain should have been thick and vigorous. Experienced farmers walked their land with increasingly serious expressions. They knew what healthy fields looked like. These were not healthy fields. Children, however, still found moments of happiness. They chased each other along muddy paths. They explored stream banks swollen by recent rains. They searched hedgerows for bird nests and early flowers. Youth often remains surprisingly resilient. For a few precious moments, they could forget what adults carried constantly. Yet even children noticed that meals remained small. They noticed that bread disappeared quickly. They noticed that their parents exchanged worried looks whenever storms gathered overhead. The famine had become part of everyday life, not an event, a condition, a permanent companion. And as spring advanced toward summer, Europe stood on the edge of another growing season that already looked dangerously familiar. The continent desperately needed sunshine. Instead, dark clouds continued building along the horizon, and far too many people were beginning to suspect that the true worst of the Great Famine had not yet arrived. The first days of May usually transformed the countryside into a celebration of renewal. Wildflowers spread across meadows. Orchards filled with white blossoms. Bees drifted lazily between flowers, while the songs of returning birds seemed to begin before sunrise and continue until evening. Farmers normally welcomed this season with cautious confidence. If the crops had survived the early weeks of spring, there was still every reason to believe the harvest might reward their efforts. This year, confidence had become a luxury. The fields looked alive. They simply did not look healthy. From a distance, the grain appeared green enough to reassure someone passing through the countryside. Up close, experienced eyes noticed countless small problems. Entire patches remained thin where seedlings had drowned weeks earlier. Low-lying fields still held pools of standing water. The roots of young plants struggled to anchor themselves in soil that never seemed to dry completely. A farmer could spend hours walking through his land without saying a single word. The crops themselves told the story. Agnes accompanied her husband one cool morning. As he inspected every strip of ground their family cultivated, he knelt beside several wheat plants, brushing muddy earth away from their roots. He gently pulled one stalk upward, The roots were short, weak, brown where they should have been pale and healthy. He quietly placed the plant back into the soil, as though disturbing it any further would somehow make matters worse. "There is still time," Agnes whispered. He nodded. "There is," but neither of them sounded convinced. Across England, royal officials had begun receiving increasingly alarming reports from sheriffs and local administrators. Harvest expectations remained poor. Grain prices refused to fall. Complaints from villages arrived with growing frequency. Kings could command armies. They could issue laws. They could collect taxes. They possessed remarkably little authority over the weather. Even the wealthiest monarch in Europe depended upon successful harvests to feed his people. The famine reminded rulers that nature often ignored political power. Throughout France, local markets displayed the same unsettling pattern. The number of buyers continued growing. The amount of grain available did not. People arrived before sunrise, hopping to purchase flour before supplies disappeared. Some waited patiently for hours, only to discover that every sack had already been sold. Occasionally, arguments broke out. Most ended as quickly as they began. Everyone understood the frustration. There was simply too little food to satisfy everyone. The village baker found himself making increasingly difficult decisions. Every morning, he measured the remaining flour with extraordinary care. He calculated exactly how many loaves could be baked without exhausting supplies before the next delivery. Customers pleaded for one more loaf, one larger loaf, a little extra. He wished he could oblige. Instead, he carefully divided each batch into smaller portions. When one customer complained that the bread seemed lighter than before, the baker merely smiled sadly. "It weighs exactly the same." The customer looked surprised. "The hunger is heavier." No one laughed. The joke had come far too close to the truth. Meanwhile, the roads of Europe remained unusually busy, not with prosperous merchants carrying luxury goods, with ordinary people searching for opportunity. Some traveled toward towns believing work might provide enough money to purchase food. Others journeyed into the countryside, hopping distant relatives, possessed fuller granaries. Entire families sometimes packed everything they owned into simple carts and headed toward places they had never seen before. Most journeys ended in disappointment. The shortage existed almost everywhere. Migration did not create food. It merely redistributed hungry people. Monasteries noticed these travelers immediately. Guest houses that once welcomed merchants and pilgrims now received increasing numbers of exhausted families, carrying little more than blankets, cooking pots, and hope. The monks offered shelter whenever possible, bread whenever available, soup stretched with vegetables and herbs. Many abbeys had already begun reducing their own meals to continue feeding strangers. One elderly brother recorded a simple observation in his chronicle. Every road now brings more mouths. Those 5 words summarized an enormous social transformation. People were beginning to move, because remaining where they were no longer guaranteed survival. The forests, too, had changed. Only a year earlier, they had seemed rich with useful plants and occasional game. Now almost every edible resource showed signs of constant gathering. Children searched beneath oak trees for forgotten acorns. Women collected every young nettle before it matured. Men checked traps that increasingly stood empty. Wild rabbits became cautious after months of relentless hunting. Even birds' eggs rarely remained unnoticed for long. Nature could replenish itself. It simply could not do so as quickly as desperate people consumed it. One afternoon, Agnes's oldest son returned from gathering firewood, carrying something hidden beneath his cloak. Carefully, he revealed 3 small eggs collected from an abandoned nest. His younger sister smiled with genuine excitement. 3 eggs. A year earlier, they might have seemed insignificant. Now they represented a feast. That evening, Agnes divided them carefully into a pot of broth. Each family member received only a few spoonfuls. Nobody complained. For several moments, supper almost felt normal again. The smallest blessings often carried the greatest emotional weight. As May progressed, another concern quietly spread through farming communities. The hay crop. Livestock depended upon hay stored during summer to survive the coming winter. After last year's disastrous harvest, reserves had already been dangerously low. If this year's grass also suffered from excessive rain, the consequences would extend well beyond grain production. Farmers needed healthy animals to plow fields, transport goods, produce milk, and breed future livestock. Without hay, many animals would perish long before the next planting season. The crisis was beginning to threaten every foundation of medieval agriculture simultaneously. Historians often describe the Great Famine as a systems failure rather than a single agricultural disaster. Poor weather damaged grain. Weak grain harvests reduced food. Reduced food weakened people. Weak laborers struggled to cultivate fields effectively. Poor hay harvests weakened livestock. Fewer healthy animals reduced future agricultural capacity. High prices disrupted trade. Malnutrition encouraged disease. Each problem intensified the next. The result resembled falling dominoes. No single failure destroyed society. Many interconnected failures slowly reinforced one another. Inside castles, noble households also began adjusting their expectations. The lavish banquets associated with medieval aristocracy became noticeably less extravagant in affected regions. Imported luxuries remained available for the wealthiest families. Basic food, however, could not simply be created through money alone. Even nobles found certain ingredients increasingly difficult to obtain. Servants quietly altered recipes. Kitchen staff stretched supplies. Game hunted from private forests supplemented shrinking stores. Although aristocrats suffered nothing like the hardships endured by peasants. The famine reminded every level of society that agriculture remained the true foundation of wealth. Gold itself could not be eaten. One cool evening, the village gathered outside the church after a special prayer service, requesting favorable weather. Clouds hung low overhead. A damp breeze carried the scent of rain once again. An elderly farmer looked toward the western horizon. "I have lived nearly 70 years, he said quietly. "I do not remember seeing the seasons behave like this." Several younger men nodded. Old memories carried authority in medieval villages. People trusted those who had witnessed decades of harvests. If the oldest among them declared the weather extraordinary, few questioned the judgment. Another farmer spoke. "My grandfather once told me of difficult years." "Were they this bad?" someone asked. The old man paused. "He said the hunger came." He looked across the muddy fields. "I do not think he imagined it could stay." That distinction mattered enormously. Most agricultural crises ended after one disappointing harvest. Europe had entered something different. Hardship had become continuous. The emotional exhaustion accumulated almost as rapidly as physical weakness. Every new rainfall reopened wounds that had barely begun healing. Every cloudy morning revived memories of the previous year. People no longer feared individual storms. They feared patterns. Late in the month, a merchant finally arrived carrying news from farther south. For a brief moment, villagers hoped conditions might have improved elsewhere. Instead, his stories offered little encouragement. Some southern districts had indeed fared somewhat better, yet their surplus proved far too small to feed enormous populations across northern Europe. Transport remained slow. Roads remained difficult. Rivers remained unpredictable, even where grain existed. Delivering it in sufficient quantities presented another challenge entirely. Europe's transportation network had never been designed to rescue an entire continent from simultaneous harvest failures. The limits of medieval logistics were becoming painfully clear. As the merchant prepared to leave, Agnes asked quietly, "Do people still believe next harvest will save us?" He considered the question carefully. "Some do, and the others, they hope." There was an important difference. Belief rested upon confidence. Hope survived, even without evidence. By the final days of May, the grain stood waist-high in many fields. It should have inspired satisfaction. Instead, experienced farmers walked between the rows with troubled expressions. The plants had grown, but they had not thrived. The ears forming within the stalks already appeared smaller than they should have been. No one needed to calculate exact yields. Years of experience allowed them to recognize disappointment long before harvest arrived. The realization spread quietly from field to field, village to village. monastery to monastery, another poor harvest was no longer merely possible. It was becoming increasingly likely, and somewhere beyond the distant horizon, summer was approaching with the power either to rescue Europe or to push millions of ordinary people deeper into one of the darkest chapters the medieval world had ever endured. June arrived beneath skies that seemed unable to make up their minds. One morning brought gentle sunshine, warm enough to dry the tops of the fields and briefly lift everyone's spirits. By afternoon, dark clouds rolled across the horizon, swallowing the light as another band of rain swept over the countryside. For a few precious hours, hope returned. Then the mud returned with it. Across northern Europe, people had begun measuring time differently, not by saints' feast days, not by market fairs, not even by the changing phases of the moon. Instead, they counted dry days. 3 consecutive days without rain became something worth discussing. A full week of sunshine seemed almost miraculous. Every clear morning encouraged cautious optimism. Every storm erased it. The weather had become the central character in everyone's life. Agnes rose before dawn, as she always had. The cottage remained quiet, except for the soft breathing of the children sleeping beneath heavy wool blankets. She carefully opened the wooden door. The air felt damp. Again, she looked toward the eastern horizon. The sun had risen, yet a wall of gray clouds already gathered in the distance. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to pray, not at first, simply because she already knew what those clouds probably meant. When her husband joined her outside, neither commented on the sky. There was no need. Both understood it perfectly. They walked together toward the fields. The narrow paths between neighboring strips had become familiar rivers of mud. Boots sank several inches with every step. Water collected in shallow depressions where children had once run freely only a few summers earlier. The grain continued growing, but healthy grain did not grow like this. Experienced farmers often judged a crop by how confidently it stood. Strong wheat reached upward. Healthy rye swayed gracefully with the wind. This year's fields leaned unevenly. Some stalks had begun falling over before reaching maturity, their roots weakened by months of saturated soil. Others displayed pale yellow patches where vibrant green should have dominated. The land looked tired, much like the people working it. Elsewhere, entire villages organized communal workdays in an effort to save vulnerable fields. Men dug drainage channels. Women carried away fallen branches, blocking streams. Older boys repaired damaged embankments. Even younger children collected stones from flooded paths to improve footing. Communities had always relied upon cooperation, but now cooperation became a necessity rather than a tradition. No single family possessed enough strength to solve these problems alone. Sometimes dozens of neighbors spent an entire day trying to drain one waterlogged meadow. Then another storm arrived overnight. The water returned before sunrise. No one stopped working, yet many quietly wondered whether their labor still mattered. One afternoon, the reeve gathered several experienced farmers beneath the large oak tree beside the church. The discussion remained calm, measured, practical. How much seed could still be saved if the harvest disappointed again? Which families appeared most vulnerable? How many oxen remained fit enough for autumn plowing? Could neighboring villages exchange labor if necessary? No one mentioned famine directly. They no longer needed to. The word had become unnecessary because everyone lived inside its reality. The village priest joined the conversation near its end. He reminded everyone that despair itself solved nothing. The reeve nodded respectfully. We are not despairing. He looked toward the fields. We are counting. That single sentence reflected the quiet mathematics governing medieval survival. Every family counted loaves. Every farmer counted sacks. Every merchant counted wagons. Every monastery counted mouths to feed. Hope remained welcome, but survival depended upon arithmetic. In larger towns, market squares grew noticeably busier, not because prosperity had returned, because uncertainty attracted buyers. Whenever rumors spread that grain shipments had arrived, crowds gathered almost immediately. Lines formed before merchants had even unloaded their wagons. People waited patiently for hours beneath light rain, hoping supplies would last until their turn arrived. Often they did not. Some customers returned home carrying flour. Others carried only disappointment. The grain merchant disliked these scenes as much as anyone. Every sack sold meant turning another customer away. He could not invent grain that did not exist. Still, angry voices occasionally followed him through the marketplace. Hunger searched constantly for someone to blame. Throughout England, monasteries reported increasing numbers of travelers requesting assistance. Some had left villages where food had nearly disappeared. Others searched for relatives willing to offer temporary shelter. Many simply wandered without any clear destination beyond the vague hope that conditions somewhere else must surely be better. The monks welcomed as many as possible. Guest halls designed for a handful of visitors now accommodated dozens. Simple straw mattresses covered stone floors. Soup kettles remained over fires almost continuously. The meals were modest, yet for many travelers, they represented the only dependable food they had received in days. One Benedictine monk carefully noted something unusual in his journal. He observed that many visitors no longer asked how long they could stay. Instead, they asked where they might find bread after leaving. The question itself revealed how completely hunger had reshaped people's thinking. Home had become less important than food. As June advanced, the countryside entered what should have been one of its most beautiful periods. Fields rippled beneath gentle breezes. Wildflowers lined narrow roads. Fruit trees displayed tiny green apples and pears that promised autumn harvests. At first glance, everything appeared almost peaceful, yet appearances often deceived. The grain heads forming atop wheat and rye remained disappointingly small. Farmers gently squeezed them between rough fingers. Too light. Again, one elderly woman, walking home from the fields, paused beside Agnes. Without speaking, she picked one head of wheat. She rubbed away the outer covering. Only a few thin kernels remained inside. She placed them silently into Agnes's hand. Nothing more needed saying. The evidence spoke for itself. Livestock continued presenting difficult choices. Cattle had survived the winter in greater numbers than many expected, but survival had come at a cost. They remained thin. Milk production stayed low. Calves grew slowly. The strongest oxen still worked daily, though their ribs showed more clearly beneath worn hides. Farmers attempted to preserve every animal possible. They understood that rebuilding herds required years. Losing them happened within weeks. Across medieval Europe, dairy products quietly disappeared from many tables. Butter became scarce. Cheese wheels grew smaller. Milk itself was often reserved for young children whenever cows produced enough. Nutrition declined further. People rarely noticed individual deficiencies. They simply recognized that everyone seemed weaker than before. One evening, Agnes's youngest daughter asked an innocent question while helping prepare supper. Will the bread be white again someday? Agnes paused while stirring the pot. She remembered soft wheat loaves from years past, bread with crisp crusts and light interiors, bread that smelled warm and sweet as it emerged from the village oven. Her daughter barely remembered such things. For the child, dark, coarse bread had become normal. Yes, Agnes answered softly. Someday. She hoped she was telling the truth. Historians today understand that prolonged malnutrition changes more than physical health. It alters expectations. People gradually forget abundance. Children raised during famine often accept deprivation as ordinary because they have known little else. An entire generation can grow accustomed to smaller meals, simpler diets, and constant uncertainty. The Great Famine was beginning to shape such a generation. By the middle of June, reports from distant regions sounded painfully familiar. Northern France, England, Scotland, the Low Countries, Western Germany. Many described similar weather, similar harvest concerns, similar shortages. Although conditions varied from place to place, the broad pattern remained remarkably consistent. Europe's agricultural heartland continued struggling beneath relentless instability. The realization slowly spread that this crisis would not remain confined to one unfortunate province. It had become continental. One afternoon, thunder rolled across the valley. Farmers looked upward, almost instinctively. Rain followed within minutes. Heavy, steady, unforgiving. Water streamed through newly dug drainage channels, already overflowing from previous storms. Small creeks burst their banks once more. Freshly repaired footbridges disappeared beneath rushing currents. Children watched from cottage windows, while adults stood silently beneath doorways. No one cursed, no one shouted. They had simply grown too tired. The storm continued through the night, then into the following morning. When the clouds finally drifted eastward, the fields glistened beneath weak sunlight, beautiful, silent, and once again carrying just enough water to threaten another season's work. As the month slowly drew toward its end, experienced farmers no longer argued about whether the harvest would disappoint. The conversation had changed. Now they asked only one question: how disappointing would it be? The answer remained hidden inside fields that still had weeks left before harvest. But every passing day suggested that Europe was moving steadily toward another season of scarcity, and beyond those waiting fields lay a summer that would force ordinary people to make choices they had prayed they would never have to face. July arrived with long daylight hours that should have been filled with confidence. In healthier years, this was the season when farmers walked through nearly mature fields with quiet satisfaction. Grain heads bent under their own weight. The color of the countryside slowly shifted from deep green toward shades of gold. Children chased one another along field edges, while adults estimated how many days remained before harvest would begin. This summer felt strangely different. The fields had indeed changed color, but not because they were full. Many stalks had begun yellowing too early, their roots damaged after months of standing in saturated soil. Others remained stunted, producing grain heads far smaller than anyone had hoped for. Here and there, entire patches had collapsed completely, flattened by repeated storms before the kernels had fully developed. A strong breeze could now do what months of hard work had failed to prevent. It knocked weakened grain into the mud. Agnes stood at the edge of one narrow strip of wheat as her husband carefully lifted a fallen stalk. The kernels inside were soft, too small, not yet ready. Another week would help, if the weather allowed. That final condition haunted every thought. If it had become the most feared word in the village. If the rain stopped, if the wind stayed calm, if mold did not spread, if enough grain could still be gathered, if, throughout much of northern Europe, July storms continued arriving with remarkable persistence. Not every day brought heavy rain, but dry periods rarely lasted long enough for fields to recover fully. The medieval farmer possessed no machinery capable of harvesting enormous areas within a narrow weather window. Everything depended upon people carrying sickles by hand. Entire families worked side by side. Neighbors helped one another, yet even thousands of willing hands could accomplish little while rain continued falling. Harvesting wet grain invited disaster. Moisture encouraged spoilage almost immediately. Grain that entered storage damp often developed mold before winter arrived. People understood this through experience, even if they could not explain the science behind it. They waited. Waiting, however, carried its own danger. Every additional day exposed the crop to more storms. One afternoon, the village reeve climbed a small hill overlooking the surrounding fields. Several farmers joined him. From that higher ground, they could see nearly the entire valley. The view should have inspired pride. Instead, it inspired calculation. One farmer pointed toward a low meadow where wheat lay flattened almost completely. Another shook his head while examining a distant barley field. The water never left. The reeve remained silent. He had spent weeks hoping the harvest might somehow exceed expectations. Now even optimism required effort. Below them, children still wandered among wildflowers growing beside the paths. They collected daisies. They chased butterflies. Life somehow continued insisting upon beauty, even while hardship deepened around it. The contrast felt almost cruel. Across towns and cities, anxiety grew alongside the crops. Millers received constant questions. When will new grain arrive? Bakers heard them. Merchants heard them. Monks heard them. No one possessed satisfying answers. Everyone depended upon the harvest. Until it began, uncertainty ruled every market. Many households had already consumed nearly every reserve saved from previous years. They lived from week to week, sometimes from day to day. The coming harvest was no longer merely important. It represented the narrow bridge separating survival from catastrophe. Inside one monastery, the cellarer, the monk responsible for managing food supplies, spent long evenings reviewing inventories by candlelight. Each sack of grain received careful attention. Each barrel of ale, each wheel of cheese. The numbers no longer comforted him. They merely confirmed what he already suspected. The abbey could continue feeding local villagers for only a limited time if the harvest disappointed again. Charity had always been central to monastic life. Now charity itself required rationing. The brothers debated difficult questions. Should travelers receive smaller portions so nearby villagers could receive more? Should food be reserved for children, for the elderly, for those still strong enough to work the fields? There were no perfect answers, only imperfect choices. One monk quietly remarked, "It is easier to divide bread than justice." The others nodded. Everyone understood. In the village, Agnes noticed another change that troubled her deeply. People had begun speaking less, not because neighbors had become unfriendly, because everyone carried the same worries. There were only so many times one could discuss the weather. Only so many ways to describe empty cupboards. Silence gradually replaced conversation. The village well, once a lively gathering place where women exchanged stories while filling buckets, had grown noticeably quieter. The blacksmith struck iron without humming. Children played shorter games before returning home. Even the dogs barked less, as though sensing the unusual mood surrounding them. Psychological fatigue settled across the community as steadily as the rain itself. Hunger did not merely weaken muscles. It exhausted hope, yet work never stopped. Farmers inspected drainage ditches. They repaired fences damaged by floods. They sharpened sickles until the blades gleamed despite years of use. Harvest preparations continued because stopping would accomplish nothing. Even a poor harvest required organization, perhaps especially a poor one. Every stalk would matter. Every handful left behind represented lost food. Women gathered baskets. Children twisted new lengths of rope for tying sheaves. Old men repaired wagons whose wooden wheels had suffered through months of muddy roads. No one expected abundance. Everyone prepared to save whatever nature still offered. By the middle of July, the first scattered harvests began in a few lighter soils where grain had ripened slightly earlier. News traveled astonishingly quickly. A messenger passing through mentioned yields from a neighboring village. They filled only half the usual number of wagons. Another traveler described fields farther east. The barley looked miserable. Then came another report, and the oats were little better. Piece by piece, the wider picture emerged. No single story sounded disastrous on its own. Together, they painted an unmistakable portrait. Europe faced another disappointing harvest. The realization spread without anyone formally announcing it. Farmers simply looked at one another differently. They no longer asked whether this year's crop would save them. Instead, they discussed how to survive another winter. Late one afternoon, Agnes's husband returned carrying a handful of wheat heads collected from several different strips of land. He laid them carefully upon the kitchen table. The children gathered around curiously. He opened each head with his fingers. Some contained only a few undersized kernels. Others had empty spaces where grain should have formed. The youngest child looked puzzled. "Is that all?" Her father smiled gently. "For this one." She nodded, accepting the explanation. Children often accepted reality more easily than adults, because they had not yet learned what reality ought to look like. Outside, thunder echoed once more across the valley. Everyone paused. No one needed to look toward the sky. The sound alone carried enough meaning. Another storm approached. The rain arrived before sunset. It continued throughout the night. Lightning illuminated cottage walls in brief flashes, while water drummed endlessly upon thatched roofs. By morning, sections of the fields lay flattened again. Some grain could still be gathered. Some could not. Every storm quietly reduced the harvest before a single sickle touched the crop. In larger market towns, officials had begun discussing extraordinary measures. Should grain exports be restricted even further? Should local storehouses be guarded? Should prices be regulated more aggressively? Such discussions reflected growing concern that shortages might soon provoke unrest. Most people remained peaceful, but authorities understood that prolonged hunger gradually eroded patience. A parent unable to feed hungry children viewed the world differently from one whose pantry remained full. Meanwhile, physicians' limited though medieval medicine was noticed another disturbing trend. Patients recovering from ordinary illnesses seemed weaker than before. Minor fevers lingered. Simple wounds healed slowly. The body fought hardest when properly nourished. Many bodies no longer possessed that strength. Disease had not yet become the central enemy, but it waited nearby, ready to exploit every weakness hunger created. The connection between famine and illness was becoming impossible to ignore. Toward the end of July, the village priest organized another procession through the fields. The congregation walked slowly between rows of struggling grain. Some carried candles despite the daylight. Others held simple wooden crosses. Their prayers were quieter now, not because faith had diminished, because exhaustion had replaced urgency. People had prayed for months. Still, they prayed again. At the highest point overlooking the valley, the procession stopped. Before them stretched hundreds of acres of ripening grain, beautiful from afar, fragile up close. The priest offered a final blessing. Then everyone stood silently for several moments. No one wished to leave. They all understood they might be looking upon the food that would decide whether their families survived another year. Within a few weeks, sickles would begin cutting those fields. There would be no more waiting, no more guessing, no more hoping that appearances were deceiving. The harvest would reveal the truth, and for countless villages across Europe, that truth was about to become even harsher than anyone had feared. August arrived with an uneasy silence that spread across the countryside before sunrise. For generations, this had been the busiest month in the agricultural calendar. Every available hand, from elderly grandparents to children barely tall enough to carry a bundle of grain, would leave home at first light and remain in the fields until dusk. Harvest was not simply another task. It was the moment upon which the entire year depended. The village awoke long before the church bell sounded. Lanterns flickered behind small windows. Oxen shifted patiently inside their shelters. The smell of damp earth drifted through the cool morning air. As families gathered their sickles, ropes, baskets, and wagons, no one spoke very loudly. The excitement that usually accompanied harvest had been replaced by quiet concentration. Every stalk mattered now. Agnes tied a simple cloth around her hair. Before before handing each child a small piece of coarse bread. The breakfast was hardly satisfying. Still, no one complained. There would be little opportunity to eat again before midday. Her husband lifted his sickle from its wooden peg near the doorway. Its blade had been sharpened so often that it had become noticeably narrower than when his father had first owned it many years earlier. He ran one thumb gently along the edge. Still sharp, still useful, like nearly everything else in the village. It had survived through careful maintenance rather than replacement. Outside, neighboring families joined the narrow path leading toward the fields. From a distance, dozens of people moved together through the morning mist. There was something almost beautiful about the sight. An entire community walking toward the same purpose. Yet beneath that shared determination lay a question no one wished to ask aloud. Would there be enough? The first swing of a sickle always carried symbolic importance. It marked the transition from uncertainty to reality. For months, people had estimated, hoped, guessed. Now guessing ended. The grain itself would provide the answer. The first bundles appeared disappointingly light. Experienced farmers recognized it immediately. The stalks occupied almost the same space as healthier harvests, yet they weighed far less when lifted. Each sheaf contained fewer kernels than it should have. The difference became unmistakable after only an hour. One wagon that normally would have been nearly full remained only half loaded. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody needed to. Every worker noticed. Harvesting continued methodically throughout the morning. Men cut the grain. Women gathered and tied it into neat sheaves. Children followed behind, carefully collecting every fallen stalk that might otherwise be left in the field. In prosperous years, a few scattered stems mattered little. This year, children crawled through muddy ground, searching for individual heads of wheat overlooked by adults. Nothing could be wasted. Nothing. By midday, the sun finally broke through the clouds. For the first time in weeks, genuine warmth spread across the valley. Farmers welcomed it eagerly. Dry weather meant harvested grain could begin curing properly before storage. For a brief moment, spirits lifted. Perhaps the remaining fields would prove slightly better. Perhaps appearances had been misleading. Then the thrashing began. Thrashing transformed bundles of grain into measurable reality. As workers beat harvested stalks against wooden frames or trampled them carefully beneath livestock, kernels separated from straw. Only then could anyone truly judge the harvest. The piles remained painfully small. Again, and again, one elderly farmer quietly watched the growing heap before speaking. I have seen poor harvests. He paused. I have not seen this. The younger men around him lowered their eyes. None wished to contradict someone whose entire life had been spent reading the land. Word traveled quickly between neighboring villages. Messengers rarely carried official reports. Instead, information spread naturally through millers, merchants, priests, and relatives, visiting one another after long days in the fields. Each conversation sounded remarkably similar. How are your yields? Poor. And yours? No better. Sometimes the answer became even shorter. A simple shake of the head. Nothing more. Across much of England, northern France, the Low Countries, and western Germany, harvest after harvest confirmed the same grim pattern. The second consecutive crop had failed to restore Europe's food supply. In many places, it had barely exceeded the disastrous harvest of the previous year. Some districts experienced slightly better conditions. Others fared considerably worse. Overall, however, there was no great abundance waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. No hidden miracle, only widespread disappointment. Inside monasteries, granaries that should have echoed with the sound of thousands of bushels being stored remained strangely quiet. The cellarer walked between newly stacked sacks. He counted carefully, then counted again. His calculations offered little comfort. The abbey possessed enough grain to survive for a time, but continuing to feed the surrounding poor throughout another year would prove almost impossible. The monks gathered after evening prayers. Their discussion was calm, respectful, and deeply painful. Should they reduce their own meals further? Could nearby monasteries share supplies? Would wealthy patrons donate additional grain? Every possibility was considered. None appeared sufficient. One brother finally observed, "We cannot multiply bread." The room remained silent. Everyone understood the biblical reference. Everyone also understood that they were ordinary men living in extraordinary circumstances. Back in the village, Agnes's family continued harvesting every available hour. Her youngest son proudly carried tiny bundles, scarcely larger than his own arms. His father thanked him as though each bundle weighed 100 pounds. Encouragement mattered. Children needed to believe they were helping. In truth, they were. Thousands of small efforts accumulated into survival. Late one afternoon, dark clouds gathered once again. Farmers glanced nervously toward the western sky. Rain before harvested grain reached shelter could undo an entire day's work. Voices became more urgent. Hands moved faster. Wagons creaked beneath hastily loaded sheaves. Even elderly workers ignored aching backs. Everyone understood the race had begun. The first heavy drops fell just as the final wagon entered the village. People rushed to cover the grain with whatever materials they possessed. Canvas, old cloth, bundles of straw. The storm arrived moments later. Sheets of rain swept across fields where uncut grain still stood waiting. No one slept particularly well that night. The sound of rainfall striking the roof seemed endless. Every hour of bad weather reduced what remained in the fields. Morning revealed the damage. Several low-lying strips had collapsed completely. Water pooled between rows of grain, not yet harvested. Some stalks could still be salvaged. Others had already begun rotting where they lay. Agnes's husband removed his hat and stood quietly for several moments. Finally, he bent down and began cutting what could still be saved. Complaining would not recover a single kernel. Work remained the only answer. Throughout Europe, similar scenes unfolded day after day. Harvest crews rushed between storms. Farmers gambled on brief periods of sunshine. Families worked until fading light made swinging sickles dangerous. The harvest became less a celebration than a rescue mission. People were no longer gathering abundance. They were trying to prevent complete loss. Meanwhile, grain prices reacted almost immediately. Merchants recognized disappointing harvests long before official figures could ever exist. As new grain reached the markets in unexpectedly small quantities, prices remained stubbornly high. Many people had hoped fresh harvests would finally lower the cost of bread. Instead, those hopes quietly disappeared. The market simply confirmed what the fields had already revealed. Scarcity remained. The psychological effect proved enormous. For nearly a year, countless families had endured hardship, believing the next harvest would restore normal life. Now that harvest stood before them, and it was not enough. Hope itself began changing shape. People no longer expected quick recovery. They began hopping merely to survive until another spring. One evening, after returning from the fields, Agnes prepared supper using the first flour ground from the new harvest. Everyone watched quietly as she baked several small dark loaves. The smell filled the cottage. For a moment, it almost resembled happier years. The family gathered around the table. Her husband broke the first loaf in half. He examined the crumb. Dense, heavy, dark. He tasted it slowly. "It is bread." Agnes nodded. Yes, neither pretended it resembled the wheat loaves they once enjoyed. Still, it was fresh, warm, made from the newest harvest. For one evening, that felt like a gift. Outside, however, the village elders had already begun calculating winter supplies once again. The numbers looked painfully familiar. Too little grain, too many mouths, too many months before another harvest. The famine had entered its second year, and although the fields had yielded enough to postpone immediate disaster in some places, they had failed to provide the recovery Europe had desperately needed. Beyond the village, along muddy roads stretching toward distant kingdoms, the same realization settled over millions of ordinary people. The harvest had spoken, and it had delivered a warning far darker than anyone had wished to hear. For the hardest decisions of the Great Famine were no longer waiting in the future. They had begun. The first wagons carrying freshly harvested grain rolled toward village barns beneath cool September skies. Ordinarily, this marked one of the happiest periods of the medieval year. Harvest songs drifted across fields. Neighbors congratulated one another on another successful season. Children played among towering stacks of straw, while livestock grazed upon freshly cut stubble. The scent of newly threshed grain filled the air, carrying with it the comforting promise that another winter could be faced without fear. This year there were no songs, only the steady creak of wooden wheels. The wagons looked strangely empty, even fully loaded. They carried noticeably less than anyone remembered from healthier years. The difference was impossible to ignore. One farmer needed only a glance to judge another family's harvest. There were fewer sheaves, smaller stacks, lower piles inside every barn. The evidence surrounded them from every direction. Agnes watched as her husband carefully arranged sack after sack against the wall of their storage shed. When he finished, there remained an uncomfortable amount of empty space. The room itself seemed larger than before. She remembered years when every corner had been filled, when extra grain had spilled into additional bins, hastily built from spare timber. Those memories now felt almost unreal. Her youngest daughter wandered inside, carrying a handful of straw. "Is this all?" Agnes looked toward the sacks. For now, the little girl accepted the answer and wandered back outside. Children rarely measured abundance the way adults did. They counted what existed. Adults counted what was missing. Across Europe, thrashing continued wherever weather permitted. Farmers beat grain loose from the stalks, tossed it into the air so autumn winds could carry away the chaff, and gathered every precious kernel into waiting sacks. Each day confirmed the same pattern. The harvest had failed to restore security. Many villages possessed enough grain to survive for several months if they rationed carefully. Very few possessed enough to feel safe. The distinction mattered enormously. Safety allowed people to think beyond tomorrow. Scarcity forced every decision to revolve around immediate survival. Inside manor houses, estate officials completed their annual accounts. They measured rents paid in grain, calculated expected winter reserves, estimated how much seed must be protected for the following spring. Many records contained disappointing totals. Some landlords quietly reduced expectations, recognizing that demanding normal obligations from struggling tenants might destroy the very communities upon which their estates depended. Others insisted upon collecting every due regardless of circumstance. Those decisions varied widely across Europe, where compassion prevailed. Villages sometimes endured the crisis with slightly greater resilience. Where rigid demands continued, hardship deepened considerably. In the village mill, activity increased steadily. Fresh grain arrived throughout the week. The familiar sound of the great millstones echoed once more across the valley. For a brief period, people almost welcomed the noise. It suggested movement, life, routine returning. Yet the miller noticed something troubling almost immediately. The flour remained darker than usual. The grain itself contained more shriveled kernels than healthy ones. He adjusted the stones repeatedly, hopping to produce finer flour. There was only so much even the finest mill could accomplish. Poor grain remained poor grain. Customers accepted their flour without complaint. They had stopped expecting perfection long ago. Throughout England and northern France, local markets reopened with fresh supplies from the harvest. Crowds gathered early. Many arrived believing prices would finally begin falling now, that new grain had entered circulation. The merchants knew better. They had already inspected the harvest. By midday, disappointment spread quietly through the marketplace. Prices remained stubbornly high, not because merchants wished to punish buyers, because replacing every sack they sold remained uncertain. No one wanted to empty a granary before winter had even begun. A laborer stood beside one grain stall, turning a few small coins over in his hand. He counted them twice, then quietly asked how much rye they would purchase. The merchant filled only a modest cloth bag. The laborer stared at it for a moment. A year ago, he stopped speaking. There was no reason to finish the sentence. Both men remembered. Both understood. The value of money had not truly changed. The value of food had. One afternoon, several neighboring villages organized a shared gathering after the harvest. In earlier years, such meetings often resembled festivals. Music, simple games, dancing, shared meals prepared from fresh bread and newly brewed ale. This gathering looked very different. Families still came together. Children still played, but the meal remained remarkably modest. Each household contributed whatever it could spare: a loaf of rye bread, a small wheel of cheese, onions, beans, cabbage, a little smoked fish. No one judged the simplicity. The very act of sharing mattered more than the quantity. An elderly woman quietly remarked, "It tastes better together." She was right. Community softened hardship, even when it could not remove it. As evening approached, conversation drifted naturally toward the coming winter. No one discussed festivals. No one planned weddings. Instead, they exchanged practical advice. Which woodland still contained edible nuts? Which streams continued yielding fish? Which herbs preserved well after drying? Knowledge itself had become a valuable resource. The famine encouraged people to remember old skills that prosperous years had allowed them to neglect. Grandparents suddenly found themselves teaching grandchildren how to recognize wild foods once considered emergency provisions. Children listened carefully. The lessons no longer felt theoretical. Meanwhile, monasteries prepared for another difficult season. The cellarer reviewed supplies once more. The infirmarian examined increasing numbers of visitors, weakened by poor nutrition. The guest master struggled to accommodate travelers arriving almost daily. Every department of monastic life reflected the wider crisis. One novice asked an older monk whether conditions had ever been this difficult before. The old brother thought for several moments. There have always been hungry people. He looked toward the nearly empty granary. I have never seen so many. Elsewhere, physicians continued observing unusual patterns among their patients. People who once recovered quickly from ordinary illnesses remained bedridden for weeks. Children grew more slowly. Pregnant women faced greater dangers. The elderly became increasingly fragile. No one understood vitamins, protein deficiencies, or immune systems. Yet everyone recognized that hunger invited sickness. The relationship revealed itself through daily experience. Agnes noticed similar changes within her own family. The children still laughed, still chased one another around the cottage, but they tired more easily. Their clothes, already patched repeatedly, hung more loosely upon thinner bodies. One evening, she quietly measured flour into a wooden bowl. She paused, then removed a handful and returned it to the sack. The loaf would be slightly smaller. Perhaps no one would notice. Her husband noticed immediately. He said nothing. Instead, he reached for the knife and cut his own portion into 2 pieces. One half quietly found its way onto the children's plates. Such sacrifices occurred countless times each day across Europe. History rarely records them. No chronicler wrote about fathers pretending they were full, or mothers claiming they had eaten earlier, or older brothers insisting younger sisters should have the last piece of bread. Yet those invisible acts of love became one of the famine's defining features. The catastrophe was measured not only through death, it was measured through generosity offered despite scarcity. By the middle of September, another unsettling trend appeared. People had begun locking their granaries more carefully, not because neighbors had suddenly become dishonest, because temptation itself had grown stronger. A sack of grain represented months of survival. Communities trusted one another. Still, trust now shared space with caution. Village watches became slightly more attentive after dark. Barn doors received stronger wooden bars. The changes were subtle, but they reflected a society becoming increasingly anxious. The Reeve addressed the village after Sunday Mass. His message remained calm. Protect your grain. Preserve seed for spring. Share with those truly in need whenever possible. Report any theft quietly before anger spread. Most importantly, remain united. Division would only worsen everyone's suffering. The villagers nodded. His advice sounded sensible. Whether unity alone could overcome another year of scarcity remained another question entirely. As September slowly gave way to cooler evenings, smoke once again drifted from cottage chimneys as families preserved what little they possessed. Apples were dried, herbs hung from rafters, beans were stored, final vegetables disappeared into root cellars. Every household prepared as carefully as possible. Preparation, however, could not create abundance. It could only organize scarcity. One clear evening, Agnes and her husband stood outside, watching the sun disappear beyond the harvested fields. Golden light stretched across neat rows of stubble, where grain had stood only weeks earlier. The landscape looked peaceful, almost prosperous. Visitors passing through might easily have admired its beauty without suspecting the truth. Her husband finally spoke. "The fields are empty." Agnes followed his gaze. "So are the barns. Not completely, but empty enough." The silence that followed carried no anger, only acceptance. The second harvest had ended. The counting had begun once again, and somewhere beyond the bright colors of autumn, another winter waited patiently, ready to test whether Europe still possessed enough strength to endure what the weather had already taken away. October arrived wrapped in cool mornings and crisp evening air. A thin mist settled across harvested fields before sunrise, softening the outlines of cottages, barns, and distant church towers. The grain had been gathered, the straw stacked, and the last wagons had long since returned from the fields. The busiest season of labor had ended. Now came the season of calculation. Throughout medieval Europe, autumn was a time for measuring the future. Farmers opened their granaries again and again, counting sacks almost as if the numbers might somehow change overnight. Housewives estimated how much flour each loaf should contain. Monks reviewed inventories by candlelight. Manor officials calculated rents and reserves. Bakers quietly adjusted recipes before customers ever noticed the difference. Every decision pointed toward the same destination. Winter. Agnes spread several handfuls of grain across a rough wooden table. Her husband joined her. Together, they separated the kernels into 3 small piles, one for food, one for seed, one for emergencies. The emergency pile looked painfully small. It remained on the table for several minutes before her husband quietly moved part of it into the food pile. Agnes watched without speaking. Neither wanted to make that choice. Both understood why it had become necessary. The mathematics of survival had become increasingly unforgiving. If they preserved too much grain for spring, the family might not survive the winter. If they consumed too much now, next year's harvest would suffer. The future and the present competed against one another every single day. Across England, estate records reflected similar dilemmas. Many tenants petitioned their landlords for temporary reductions in rents owed after 2 disappointing harvests. Some local lords recognized the danger immediately. A dead tenant paid no rent. An abandoned farm produced no crops. In certain manors, obligations were quietly reduced or delayed. Elsewhere, customs remained unchanged. Collectors still expected grain, labor, or payment according to long-established agreements. The famine revealed striking differences in leadership from one estate to another. Acts of mercy rarely appeared in official records with dramatic language. Sometimes compassion consisted merely of demanding a little less. Markets continued operating, though their atmosphere had changed completely. The cheerful noise that had once characterized autumn trading had faded. Conversations became quieter. Purchases became smaller. Customers approached grain merchants with remarkable caution. Many asked the same question before discussing price. Will there still be enough later? The merchant almost never answered directly because he did not know. His uncertainty matched theirs. Merchants themselves faced difficult calculations. Selling too quickly risked empty shelves before winter. Holding supplies too long invited accusations of greed. Some genuinely tried balancing profit with responsibility. Others viewed scarcity as opportunity. Both kinds existed side by side. The famine did not suddenly transform human nature. It merely exposed it more clearly. One traveling merchant arrived from eastern regions carrying reports that conditions varied considerably from place to place. Some districts had harvested enough to avoid immediate crisis. Others had suffered losses almost identical to those farther west. The encouraging news remained limited. There was no enormous reserve waiting to rescue the continent. The disappointing harvest had been too widespread. Europe remained trapped within the same fragile system. One afternoon, the village blacksmith repaired a broken plowshare brought by a neighboring farmer. As sparks flew from glowing iron, the two men spoke quietly. Will you sow all your fields next spring? The farmer hesitated. If I have enough seed, and if you do not. The answer came after a long silence. I will sow what I can. Across thousands of villages, similar conversations unfolded. Entire communities were already worrying about a harvest still many months away. That alone revealed how completely famine had altered daily life. Ordinarily, autumn belonged to the present. Now it belonged to the future. The forests surrounding the village displayed brilliant colors. Oak leaves turned deep brown. Beech trees glowed with warm shades of copper. Children wandered beneath falling leaves, collecting chestnuts in woven baskets. For a few weeks, the woodland offered modest gifts. Nuts, late berries, occasional mushrooms. Families welcomed every additional source of nourishment. Yet even these seasonal resources seemed more crowded than before. People arrived earlier, gathered more thoroughly, left little behind. Nature continued providing. Human need had simply grown far greater. Agnes accompanied several neighboring women into the forest one cool morning. Their baskets gradually filled with chestnuts hidden beneath fallen leaves. One younger woman smiled as she uncovered a particularly large cluster. It feels like treasure. Another nodded. It is. No one laughed. The comparison felt entirely appropriate. Back in the village, chestnuts would be dried, ground, or boiled into stews that stretched precious grain a little further. Every basket represented several more meals, several more days. Sometimes survival depended upon increments that small. Inside monasteries, preparations for winter accelerated. Monks salted vegetables, stacked firewood, repaired roofs before heavy snow arrived. The rhythm of monastic life continued despite growing hardship. Prayer, work, study, charity, those familiar routines offered stability during uncertain times. Even so, the abbot noticed increasing strain among the brothers. Meals had become noticeably simpler. Fasting, once a voluntary religious discipline observed on certain holy days, increasingly resembled ordinary life. One novice quietly admitted that he sometimes dreamed about fresh bread. The older monks understood. Several confessed experiencing the same dreams. Throughout Europe, hunger occupied people's thoughts even while they slept. Dreams of full tables appeared in countless cottages. Memories became nourishment of their own. By mid-October, livestock that had grazed through summer returned gradually toward winter shelters. Farmers examined each animal carefully. Every cow, every sheep, every pig. The decisions made now would shape the coming months. Keeping additional livestock alive required valuable fodder. Slaughtering too many reduced future prosperity. Again, there was no perfect answer, only trade-offs. Agnes's family still owned fewer animals than they had before the famine began. The empty places inside the small barn reminded them daily. One stall remained vacant. Another housed a cow, noticeably thinner than previous winters. Her husband stroked the animal gently along its neck. "We need you until spring." The cow blinked quietly. She had no understanding of the enormous burden resting upon her survival. Historians often emphasize grain when describing medieval famines. Grain certainly formed the foundation of the diet, yet livestock mattered almost as much. Without healthy animals, fields could not be plowed efficiently. Milk disappeared. Cheese became scarce. Manure for fertilizing land declined. Transportation slowed. Every missing ox echoed through future harvests. The famine's effects reached far beyond bread alone. Late one afternoon, a stranger appeared at the edge of the village. His clothing suggested he had traveled many miles. His boots were worn nearly through. He carried no wagon, only a small bundle across one shoulder. The reeve greeted him cautiously. The traveler explained that his home village farther north had suffered especially poor harvests. He hoped to find temporary work before winter. Several villagers exchanged uncertain glances. Work itself had become scarce, food even scarcer. Still, one farmer eventually stepped forward. "I can use another pair of hands." The stranger bowed his head gratefully. His wages would not be generous, mostly meals, perhaps a little grain, yet that offer likely saved his life. Such quiet acts of practical kindness occurred repeatedly throughout the famine. Not every village welcomed outsiders. Some feared they could barely feed their own families. Others continued sharing what little they possessed. Human responses varied enormously. As October drew toward its close, nights grew noticeably colder. Frost whitened rooftops before dawn. Breath became visible in the morning air. Children delighted in crunching frozen grass beneath their feet. Adults looked toward the horizon with growing concern. Winter approached steadily now. There would be no delaying it. One evening after supper, Agnes lit a single candle while the children settled near the hearth. Her husband removed a small piece of charcoal and marked another line upon the wooden board hanging beside the pantry. Notches now represented weeks remaining, until spring rather than grain already consumed. The board had become a calendar of endurance. Each mark reminded the family how long they still needed their supplies to last. The children watched curiously. "What are you doing?" the youngest asked. He smiled gently, counting the nights. She accepted the explanation. Only Agnes understood its deeper meaning. He was counting hope. Outside, the wind carried the last autumn leaves across empty fields, where next year's dreams already rested beneath the soil. Those fields now waited silently through shortening days, while inside countless homes across Europe, families tightened their rationing once again, because despite all their labor, despite every prayer, despite 2 exhausting harvests, the food they had gathered would still have to carry them through another long winter, and many were beginning to fear it would not be enough. The days grew steadily shorter. By November, the sun climbed only briefly above the horizon before fading once again into long afternoons of pale gray light. Smoke drifted constantly from cottage chimneys, hanging low over villages before disappearing into cold autumn skies. Frost lingered until midday, and every morning seemed quieter than the one before. The countryside had entered its season of waiting. Fields rested beneath empty skis. The last leaves surrendered to the wind. The roads, churned by months of wagons and livestock, gradually hardened beneath colder temperatures. Outwardly, everything appeared peaceful. Inside homes across Europe, another story unfolded. Agnes measured flour with almost ceremonial precision. She no longer filled the wooden bowl. She simply added enough to bake the next day's bread. Every handful removed from the sack carried a silent calculation. How many days remained? How many mouths still needed feeding? How much could be spared? The answers changed constantly. None brought comfort. The children had grown accustomed to smaller meals. That, more than anything else, troubled their parents. The youngest no longer asked why the bread looked dark. She no longer remembered white wheat loaves. Her memories were now shaped entirely by famine. An entire childhood had quietly adapted to scarcity. Across countless villages, similar changes were taking place. Children born during these difficult years would carry lifelong memories not of abundance, but of careful rationing, thin soups, and parents pretending not to be hungry. Historians can estimate harvest yields. They can calculate grain prices. They can approximate the number of lives lost. What they cannot fully measure is the quiet transformation inside ordinary families. The habits created by famine often survived long after the famine itself had passed. People learned never to waste bread, never to trust perfect weather, never to assume that one good harvest guaranteed another. Memory itself became a form of preparation. Winter had not yet reached its harshest point, but Europe was already exhausted. The Great Famine of ****1315, 1317* would continue claiming lives before favorable harvests finally returned. Historians estimate that in some of the hardest hit regions, between 10 and 15% of the population may have died from hunger, disease, or the combined effects of prolonged malnutrition. Entire villages shrank. Families disappeared from tax records. Farms stood abandoned for years. The catastrophe weakened economies, altered patterns of land ownership, and left deep emotional scars that survived for generations. Perhaps its greatest legacy was invisible. The famine reminded medieval Europe how fragile civilization truly was. Magnificent cathedrals stood proudly above crowded towns. Kings ruled powerful kingdoms. Merchants crossed seas, carrying valuable cargo. Yet all of it ultimately rested upon something astonishingly simple. Whether grain grew in the fields, a few seasons of relentless rain had achieved what invading armies often could not. They humbled an entire continent. Ironically, only a few decades later, Europe would face another catastrophe that has become far more famous in popular memory: the Black Death. When plague arrived in the mid-14th century, many communities were still living with the long shadow left by the famine. Generations weakened by years of poor nutrition and economic hardship entered one of history's deadliest pandemics, already carrying the burden of earlier suffering. The Great Famine did not cause the plague, but it helped shape the world the plague encountered. Today, modern agriculture, international trade, refrigeration, transportation networks, weather forecasting, and scientific farming have dramatically reduced the likelihood that weather alone could produce a famine on the same continental scale across Europe. Yet the story remains remarkably relevant. It reminds us how deeply every civilization depends upon reliable food systems. It reminds us that climate has always influenced history far more than many people realize. Most importantly, it reminds us that behind every historical disaster stand millions of ordinary people whose names were never written into history books. People like Agnes, her husband, their children, the miller, the blacksmith, the monks quietly recording events by candlelight, the traveling merchant searching muddy roads, the widow who gave away her last piece of cheese because another family needed it more. History often celebrates kings, battles, and great political decisions, but the true story of Europe's worst famines belongs just as much to those ordinary people who endured each difficult day with quiet determination. Their courage rarely appeared in chronicles. Their resilience built the future. Eventually, the seasons changed once again. The rains eased. Healthier harvests slowly returned. Granaries gradually filled. Children once more tasted fresh bread without wondering whether there would be enough tomorrow. The continent recovered, slowly, patiently, never completely forgetting. And perhaps that is where we should leave our own journey tonight, not with despair, but with quiet respect for the millions who endured one of medieval Europe's greatest hardships without ever imagining that people 7 centuries later would still remember their struggle. If you made it this far, thank you for spending this quiet journey through history with me. If you enjoyed this episode of Asterisk Boring History, for sleep asterisk asterisk, I'd truly appreciate it if you subscribed and joined me for the next adventure through the forgotten corners of the past. Now, as the candlelight grows dim and the last autumn wind drifts across those empty medieval fields, it's time to let the village disappear into the mist once more. Close your eyes. Let the church bell fade into the distance and allow history at last to fall peacefully asleep.